Hello, and welcome to an introduction to human trafficking for community members. This webinar was created by the Human Trafficking Initiative of Metropolitan Family Services. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at trafficking@metrofamily.org or give us a call at 312-986-4200. In this webinar, we will be discussing the following: what is human trafficking, indicators of human trafficking, remedies for survivors, and how the community can help in the fight against human trafficking. First and foremost, what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. It is the exploitation of a person for the purpose of compelled labor or a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Here we can see multiple examples of how force, fraud, and coercion can be used in trafficking. First, we have force. This is the use of actual physical force or restraint. A trafficker may use linguistic, social, or physical isolation, may use physical assault or battery against the victim, or even go as far as sexual assault. Fraud pertains to lies or misrepresentations to trick or defraud the victim. This can be through promises of marriage, of love or support, promises of certain working conditions or pay or benefits associated with that work. It could be through debt bondage or confiscation of identification documents. Lastly, we have coercion, and these are threats of harm or threats to abuse the legal process. We see this in threats of deportation or threats of physical or violent harm to the victim themselves or possibly their coworkers or family or friends. It can be through threats of arrest or threats to report the victim to authorities. Also, this could be through confiscation of identification or other documents. Let's talk a little bit about labor trafficking. Compelled labor or labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting that person to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Let's take a minute to look at Anne's story here. Anne was smuggled into the U.S. from Thailand. She was promised legal immigration status and a job. She was set up with a job at a restaurant, but her smuggler did not obtain immigration papers for her. Anything Anne earned working at the restaurant went directly to her smuggler. Anne was forced to work 14-hour days with only a 5-minute break per day to eat. She and other employees were housed in the restaurant, sharing one small room. When she complained, the manager hit her and told her he would have her deported if she complained again. When she told the smuggler what had happened, he said that if she tried to escape, he would kill her parents back home. Anne's story is one of the common ways that worker exploitation evolves into labor trafficking. We have many indicators of trafficking beyond the smuggling: the long and unusual work hours without much break, her housing situation, as well as the physical violence. Now let's discuss sex trafficking. A sex act becomes a commercial sex act when anything of value is exchanged for that act. The thing exchanged does not need to be money. It can be the promise to do or not to do something. It can be an exchange for a favor, or an exchange of goods or services. It also does not need to come into the hands of the victim. For example, a case that happened in the United States involved parents who offered their car salesman to have sex with their 14-year-old daughter instead of paying the car installment payments. The sex act became a commercial sex act when the car installment payments were used in exchange for the sex. A third person, namely the child's parents, benefited from the child's sex act. It's important to note when the victim of a sex trafficking is a minor under the age of 18, he or she does not need to show that force, fraud, or coercion. Thus, even if a child agrees to engage in sex acts and a third person benefits from the act, the child is still considered a victim. Moreover, the definition of sex trafficking of minors includes any kind of pornography involving minors as well. Again, under trafficking laws, anyone under 18 cannot agree to sex acts or child pornography. Thus, in the previous case, even if the daughter agreed to have sex with the car salesman, she would still be considered a victim because it happened when she was under 18 years of age. In another example, in U.S. versus Lewis, the trafficking of all the girls in that case followed the same pattern. Defendant Shelby Lewis would approach with a desire to induce prostitution girls who were young, uneducated, and socioeconomically marginalized. Some were homeless or runaways. Defendant invited each victim to live with him, to have sex with him, and instructed them how to work as prostitutes. As they were all under 18, they were all considered trafficking victims. Both federal and Illinois laws provide safe harbor for anyone under the age of 18 who is providing commercial sex acts. What does this mean? That means that they will not be arrested or charged with solicitation or prostitution, and they are to be considered a trafficking survivor and referred to appropriate services. So who can be a victim? It's anyone. Victims can be U.S. citizens or non-citizens, men or women, adults or children, strangers, friends, family members, your neighbors. They can come from various socioeconomic backgrounds. The same can be said for traffickers as well. They can be U.S. citizens or non-citizens, men or women, adults or children, strangers, friends, family members, neighbors, may or may not be members of the same ethnic origin or nationality as their victims. And again, they can come from various socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, it's important to note there is a difference between smuggling and human trafficking. Smuggling is considered a crime against the state and involves movement, namely the transportation of foreign citizens into the United States with the deliberate evasion of U.S. immigration laws. Trafficking, however, is considered a crime against persons, not the state, as defined under U.S. and Illinois laws. It also involves exploitation. Thus, it may happen to both citizens and non-citizens and does not require movement. Many victims were and are born in and raised in Illinois and trafficked in Illinois. However, smuggling can evolve to trafficking, just like Anne's story in the previous slide. The fact of being smuggled is used by traffickers against victims like Anne to keep them in their trafficking situation. But smuggling does not negate their status as trafficking victims, nor their ability to seek legal or immigration relief to escape the trafficking situation. Another case that occurred in 2005 involved the initial smuggling of workers from Peru. Once they arrived in the United States, instead of letting the workers go, the smugglers forced the workers to stay in the smugglers' home and to work for them. They were supposed to work until they supposedly paid off the smuggling debt they owed to the smugglers, who are now traffickers. The debts ranged from $6,000 to $13,000. The traffickers confiscated the victims' passports, all of the workers' pay, and threatened them with reporting to authorities in case they tried to escape. During the raid of 3 houses, which the traffickers owned, the authorities found 69 Peruvians living in squalid conditions. 13 of them were minors. That said, trafficking victims who are foreign nationals are not always undocumented, or do not always come in to the United States using false documents. Many enter the United States with valid visas and end up in situations of slavery. There have been trafficking victims who have come to the United States on a K-1 or fiancé visa, on temporary worker visas such as the H-1B or H-2B visas, on student or exchange program visas such as the J-1 or F-1 visas, and others like the religious worker visas, international organization workers staff visa, and the like. In the case of David versus Signal International, workers from India were recruited under the H-2B working visa process to work at Signal's shipyards in Mississippi and Texas. The workers each paid the labor recruiters and a lawyer between $10,000 and $20,000, some paying even more, in recruitment fees and other costs after recruiters promised good jobs, green cards, and permanent U.S. residency for them and their families. Most sold property or plunged their families deeply into debt to pay the fees. Once they arrived in the United States, they were abused and mistreated. They were made to sleep in cramped, heavily guarded quarters and were not allowed to leave the work premises. They faced disparagement because of their nationality. Those who tried to complain were detained with threats of deportation. This is just one of the many examples of how foreign nationals often do enter with valid visas, and it ends up turning into a trafficking situation. This map shows the various industries where trafficking has been found. It is not representative of the actual geographic location where the trafficking has occurred. The multitude of industries where trafficking has occurred can exist anywhere in the United States. For instance, in Illinois, sex trafficking has been found in hotels, residential brothels, escort services, and through the internet. Labor trafficking has occurred in domestic work, factories, massage parlors, agriculture, landscaping, and others. The list of industries is not exhaustive by any means. It grows longer as more trafficking incidences are uncovered in other industries, such as door-to-door or traveling sales crew, and even healthcare. Now let's move on to human trafficking indicators. Trafficking is considered a hidden crime because it happens in both legitimate and illegitimate industries. Victims often do not self-identify as victims. The trafficker's power and control is not always easy to discover. But the methods of power and control can manifest on a victim in various ways, and the community can help detect it by looking closer. The indicators of trafficking can be grouped into three general categories: physical indicators, the surrounding circumstances, and the psychological indicators. Let's start with the physical indicators. A trafficking victim may present as malnourished, could have serious dental issues because they haven't seen a dentist in years, may have bruises, scars, or signs of physical abuse or torture. They may have a workplace injury, potentially that has gone untreated for weeks, months, years. They possibly could have chronic pain. This shows that a primary objective of a trafficker is economic gain. The victims are tools to make money and should keep working to make that money until they cannot due to disability or physical ailment that impedes the work. For instance, a nationwide trend is that gangs are changing their modus from drug trafficking to sex trafficking. It's more lucrative because one victim can generate money every day, as opposed to a one-time source of revenue like drugs. Another physical indicator may be branding tattoos that show the name or symbol of their controller or trafficker. Besides names or symbols, the trafficker may have forced certain words associated with their power and control, such as loyalty or family, on their victims. Now let's check the surrounding circumstances. Is there limited freedom or indications of limited freedom? Are there high security measures in the work or the living locations? Is the individual not free to come and go as they please? Is there a lack of control? Victims may have few or no personal possessions. They may not have any control over their own money, their records, or bank accounts. They may owe a very large debt and are continually unable to pay it off. They may not be in control of their own identification documents or know where they are. They may be unable to speak for themselves, having someone else always speaking on their behalf. This could be because of the trafficker would state that the victim may be too young to express themselves, do not speak the language, or are not able to express themselves adequately. Let's look at the work conditions. If the individual is under 18 and providing commercial sex acts. In the commercial sex industry, if they have a pimp or a manager. If they're working excessively long hours or unusual hours, or not allowed breaks, even to use the restroom, or suffer under unusual restrictions at work. Perhaps they were recruited via false promises regarding the nature and conditions of the work they are performing. And lastly, maybe they're unpaid or paid very little, or paid only through tips. Lastly, let's look at the psychological or mental indicators of trafficking victims. A victim may be experiencing anxiety, hopelessness, sleeplessness, exhaustion, depression, or the intense fear of being alone. These indicators may show that a victim does not have sufficient rest days or they're working very long hours. These may also reflect their constant fear due to threats of the trafficker that the victim will be deported or will be reported to authorities. Hence, they may have a significant fear of authorities. They may avoid eye contact when an image or an individual in authority is speaking with them. They may be disoriented. They don't know where they are at the time of day or what date it is. Some trafficking victims are moved around from state to state. Not staying in one place helps erase the trafficker's tracks. So victims often do not know where they are. Their stories might change. Victims may be made to memorize a story and sometimes to change their name to conceal the trafficking. Now let's practice a bit. In this slide, what are the indicators of labor trafficking in this scenario? As you can see in the beginning, there's some form of confiscation of a passport or some identification document by the employer. Next, we see the number of beds in the room reflecting a substandard housing condition for the worker to live in. In the middle, we see the worker is made to work long hours and even in inclement weather, causing him to fall ill. Lastly, we see possibly some form of threat of deportation or reporting to authorities with that identification document being waved in his face. Furthermore, he's unable to take sufficient rest despite being sick, and he's forced to go back to work. Any of these indicators on its own may not be enough to show a trafficking situation, but it may be reflective of a case of labor exploitation. However, lumping all the indicators together, there are enough indicators to warrant a further review of the work situation and may yield a case of labor trafficking. Here's another example, a case from some years ago that happened in a New York State fair. Some workers from Mexico were brought on H-2B visas, that's temporary worker visas, to help sell food at the fair. They worked 16 to 18-hour days for 2 weeks, and on the 12th day worked for 24 hours. They were promised $10 an hour, but paid only $1. They begged for food from people. They were made to share beds infested with bed bugs, and the workers eventually got super sick but were still forced to work and serve the food. The employer allowed one worker eventually to go to the health center only after the bites were all over the worker's hands and feet, rendering him incapable to do the work. Eventually, the workers were connected to a labor nonprofit group who helped report a case of stolen wages to the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. The Department of Labor found that because of all of the circumstances, it was not just a wage issue, but actually trafficking. How about this scenario? What indicators do you see here? From the first initial images, you see that this starts out as a romantic relationship, but quickly escalates into physical and possibly emotional or mental abuse. Later in the series, you see he is forcing her into a car, taking money in exchange for what we can assume is a commercial sex act with another man. There was fraud on this man's part. His acts or promises of love were meant to conceal his true intent. The physical assault was a way to ensure power and control. The second to last panel shows the woman bruised and tired and in distress. One more. In this scenario, what indicators show that this may also be a case of trafficking? Look at where the woman sleeps. She's in a garage without a proper bed. Look at how much work she has to do around the house. But not only that, she is forced to scrub the floor with a toothbrush. You can also see her employer yelling at her over a spot. The employer's psychological abuse is a use of her privilege and a form of power and control over her domestic worker. Many trafficking cases involve domestic servitude with scenarios similar to this exact scene. The worker may be controlled through linguistic isolation, where he or she is unable to communicate with others because he or she speaks a foreign language. Control through physical isolation may also occur where a worker's movements are strictly controlled or monitored through the use of a tracking device or cameras in the household, or is prohibited from going anywhere, mingling with others, or making any friends. The domestic worker is also paid very little or almost nothing, is not provided sufficient time to rest, or is forced to work long 8 hours a day, every day. There may be verbal abuse, physical abuse, or sometimes sexual abuse as well. This is a map from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, showing the hotspots for calls to the Trafficking Hotline. The Trafficking Hotline was established in 2007. The darker areas show where more calls were received compared to other places throughout the country. In 2017, there were 632 calls in Illinois made to the hotline, 193 cases of trafficking as well. From 2007 to 2017, there were 4,368 calls in Illinois made to the hotline. In those years, over 1,500 victims exhibited high indicators of trafficking, while there were nearly 1,300 that indicated moderate indicators. The hotline relies greatly on concerned citizens. The number one resource of tips were community members, or as some call it, Good Samaritans. The second source of the most tips are the trafficking victims themselves. Other sources, though, include family members, victims of other crimes, or nonprofit staff. The hotline is a great resource because of its accessibility 24/7, its ability to provide free linguistic services, and it is confidential. They have a directory of services for every state in the United States. The hotline will help you assess whether you have encountered a potential survivor of human trafficking, identify local community resources to help survivors, as well as coordinate with those local service agencies to help protect and serve survivors so they will begin the process of restoring their lives. Lastly, there are remedies available to survivors. One remedy may be to vacate or expunge criminal records of prostitution and other crimes forced to commit during their trafficking. Prostitution convictions are eligible at any time after an entry of a verdict or a finding of guilty. So that means either immediately at that entry of a verdict, or it could be years later as long as there's due diligence. Again, there is a reminder, though, that minors should not be charged or prosecuted for prostitution. Criminal records may be eligible for immediate sealing upon completion of his or her sentence if the underlying offense was a direct result of trafficking. Another remedy available would be restitution or payment for harm caused from the trafficking. The restitution could be for back pay or proper wages. It could be payment for medical, or legal, or psychological harm caused by the trafficking. Restitution could also be for other damages. For example, some traffickers take out loans in the name of the victim, so that restitution would help pay back those loans as well as provide them some support after. Restitution for victims can come through criminal cases in federal or state court, through civil cases, so through the court system, through labor agencies or commissions. They also might be eligible for crime victim compensation as well. Furthermore, there is immigration relief possibly available to survivors of human trafficking. For example, there may be a T visa eligibility for a survivor. The T visa is strictly for survivors of human trafficking. The U visa, which is for immigrant victims of crime, may also be available to a victim. Trafficking may be one of those crimes, or they could be a crime of sexual assault, DV, kidnapping, fraud and foreign labor contracting, etc. It encompasses a multitude of different crimes that an individual may qualify for, a U. Lastly, an individual may be eligible for immigration relief under VAWA, or the Violence Against Women Act. Lastly, there may be case management services available to those survivors. Case management services will help an individual connect to counseling if that is deemed necessary, can help with applications for benefits, possibly found housing, etc., depending on what the client is in need of in order to restore their lives. As well as case management services may be able to have funds for those victims, again, depending on the situation that best serves the victim themselves. Here is a list of some of the services that are available in Illinois. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the services provided throughout the state of Illinois, but gives you an idea of some of the services in the legal field as well as comprehensive social services that may be available for victims and survivors. And that concludes our webinar. If you have any questions, comments, or need for technical assistance, please feel free to reach out to us at trafficking@metrofamily.org. Thank you.